This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hi, Thomas.
And today we are discussing a classic film, The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch, came out in 1980. We're discussing this because he recently passed away, and we decided to take the opportunity to watch this film, which is the film of his that I've always wanted to watch the most. And for that, we have a guest with us, a returning guest, Andrew Petiprin, who runs the Space Solvi Institute and co-authored a book published by Word on Fire about the Vatican film list titled Popcorn with the Pope, which he was on previously to discuss. And I also want to mention that Andrew and I did a panel at the recent conference at Notre Dame at the end of last year, where we talked about film, including the Vatican film list. And I don't know if I've plugged that video on the podcast, but Notre Dame did upload that since it happened. And so I will link to that in the show notes for anyone who wants to hear it. It's a talk by me, a talk by Nathan Douglas, our frequent co-host, a talk by Andrew, and then some Q&A. So you can check that out if you want. And I'll just welcome Andrew back to the podcast.
Glad to be back with you guys.
Well, David Lynch, he's such an interesting director because, the first thing I saw by him years ago was the first 12 or so episodes of Twin Peaks. And what struck me about that, and I think what people talk about as typical of his style a lot, is kind of the mix of, in that case of that show, almost soap opera-esque sentimentality at times, and kind of like, a certain view of American life, combined with, a surreal, absurd, or at times nightmarish quality, and kind of like so a lot of his work, I understand, runs like that. There's a couple of his other films that people mention a lot: Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive. I haven't so much wanted to watch those because I've heard Blue Velvet is just very perverse, and Mulholland Drive is described as, an erotic thriller or something like that. So I'm sure those films have their virtues. I just haven't been eager to watch them. But I've always heard The Elephant Man was very inspiring and uplifting. So I watched that. And I also did watch his first feature film, Eraserhead, just to get some context. Partially because people say Elephant Man is not entirely typical of what has come to be associated with his style. It's maybe a little bit more accessible among his films. So I wanted to check out some of his weirder stuff as well. I think Andrew, I don't know which of you guys has seen the most David Lynch films.
I'm not super well read, well viewed on David Lynch. I also have seen quite a bit of Twin Peaks. I've seen some of David Lynch's short films. And I also saw Dune, which, nice. It's funny. You wouldn't necessarily think that you'd be able to identify a whole lot of overlap between a film like Dune and The Elephant Man. But I feel like there's some similar aesthetic qualities between the two. But what about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I have seen Eraserhead now just as of yesterday, which I had always wanted to watch and finally got around to it. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But I've seen Eraserhead. I've seen The Elephant Man several times. I've seen The Straight Story, which is a very nice little movie from the late 90s. I've seen Lost Highway, which I don't remember at all. I've seen Mulholland Drive, which I remember. I've seen that one a couple of times and I liked it, but I still don't really have any idea what it's about. And I've seen Dune, but I have never seen Blue Velvet. I've seen bits of Inland Empire. I have not seen the whole thing. I've never seen Wild at Heart. I'm trying to think what are the other ones. Oh, and Twin Peaks. I have seen the 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, but I've never seen any of the kind of additional stuff.
All right, so you are our Lynchian authority here.
Yeah, I would hardly say so. And actually, I was thinking, Thomas, when you were talking about the talks that we gave at Notre Dame, one of the comments that was made, at least to me, I think maybe to all three of us, was that we were focused mostly on Europe and European cinema. And I think it's interesting that, David Lynch is a kind of uniquely American director. I mean, he's one of the great American directors, I guess, but also I think is, he's actually been described, I forget who it was, but I found somewhere a critic referred to him as a populist surrealist. And he really is a kind of a uniquely American surrealist. Like he takes this European style kind of theater of the absurd and puts it through the lens of what we see in the United States. So I'm glad to get to talk about an American director, although I don't consider myself an expert.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When we heard the news that David Lynch had passed away, that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to take the opportunity to take a look at him, is because he is an American director and a modern one at that. And so I think he's worth discussing if for no other reason than that he's one of our own and quite influential. But also, I think, what you're describing too, this surrealist streak in him, very hand in hand with a lot of what I understand of the larger surrealist tradition of work. Of course, most of it, if not all of it, especially early on, being European, French avant-garde. But his work sits, not only like kind of neatly in there, but also demonstrates a real knack for kind of the fundamentals of storytelling. That was something that I kind of kept coming back to during The Elephant Man, was just how well crafted of a film this actually is. So yes, you have some of these more surrealist gestures, maybe some things that kind of tip the hat toward, Lynch as a visual artist, and sort of interested in the visuals and
he started out as a painter,
right. But then also it's just a very well crafted screenplay, with a lot of what you would expect from a good, Hollywood movie. Ironically, this, or maybe perhaps not, it's mostly British artists involved in this, right? So even though he's a great American filmmaker, this is sort of like all of your heavy hitters. We've got John Gielgud, we've got Anthony Hopkins, and then of course John Hurt as John Merrick, the Elephant Man.
Right.
But I think that this is a great, especially for anybody who wants to dip their toes into the surrealist waters. David Lynch is probably a good person to do that with. Yeah,
and I don't know what the story behind, in terms of screenwriting, what the story behind a lot of his films is, or kind of how they had their genesis. I think Eraserhead is basically, his idea. It took a long time to make it. But in the case of Elephant Man, this was, a script that by two other guys that had been optioned, and then, he was brought on board by Mel Brooks, of all people. Executive produced it. He's not credited because he didn't want people to have the wrong kind of expectations for what kind of movie this would be. It's like some kind of crazy comedy or something. But Mel Brooks had loved Eraserhead and thought David Lynch would be perfect for telling this, this true story of the Elephant Man. A couple other credits I think are worth noting. It was edited by Anne V. Coates, who had a very long career. She edited Lawrence of Arabia. She edited Beckett. And the cinematographer was a two-time Oscar winner, Freddie Francis, who maybe is best known by American viewers for Glory, a film that I haven't seen. But so this film was nominated for several Academy Awards. And though it may seem strange now, black and white film that came out in 1980 has a lot of strange stuff going on, was also very commercially successful at the time. So it is probably, it is a beloved film. I guess probably a lot of Americans who haven't heard of David Lynch per se have probably heard of or seen this film. Do you want to do the synopsis of what this is about?
Yeah, really quickly. The film is, I guess you could call it a bit of a biopic about, in the film, it's John Merrick, but the real life character, historical figure is Joseph Merrick, an Englishman from early 1900s, late 1800s, who suffered from some sort of a syndrome, had some terrible deformities such that he was known by the moniker of the Elephant Man. this film follows John Merrick as he is sort of discovered by Anthony Hopkins, his character, Dr. Treves. He's into anatomy, and I guess in this time, this was a thing for ambitious doctors to sort of go out seeking freakish looking people and sort of use them to get a name for themselves. It's not clear that that's exactly what Dr. Treves is doing here, but regardless, he definitely finds himself drawn to John. He wants to help John, and then the rest of the film is sort of John being rescued from this freak carny existence, brought into English society through Dr. Treves, and sort of how he's embraced or taken advantage of there. So that's Elephant Man in a nutshell.
Yep.
Would you add anything to that, Andrew?
I think that's about right. I think it's set in Victorian England and kind of towards the later stages of Victoria, so kind of later 19th century. And I think that's significant because I think that there's a bit of a critique of industrialization, of it kind of industrial society
Definitely.
going on, which you get it right from the beginning with like sort of there's all these like train whistles and smoke and all this stuff. And there's this kind of oppressive, grimy, Victorian London feel, and then the kind of surrealist dream of the elephant trampling the mother, John Merrick's mother, kind of superimposed on top of that. So my reading of that is that it's something like kind of the wrath of nature, and that the Elephant Man is a kind of like horrible outproduct of man trying to conquer nature, and sort of these weird sort of horrible kind of body horror things like results, and you get a little bit of that in Eraserhead as well, but the Elephant Man goes in a much different direction.
I think that's spot on. It's very subtly woven in as a theme throughout the film. It's not as though you could be forgiven for watching this movie and not really picking up on that thread necessarily.
Yeah.
But certainly from the beginning, there does seem to be this sort of underlying oppressiveness from machines and industrialization. So specifically, that surrealist sequence that the film opens up with, which just, by the way, I think is awesome. I really like that opening sequence. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. But in the background, you hear this rhythmic machinery that actually we get to see later, about like halfway through the film. I'm not exactly sure what kind of a machine these men are operating, but later we the same sound returns, and now we see the men who are working this machine. And but certainly elsewhere, as Dr. Treves is walking through the streets of London, there's a lot of sludge and smoke and, yes, machinery and noise and things going on. You see the effects of industrialization on the city. And then at a few other places throughout, and it's even mentioned specifically when we're sort of first getting to know Dr. Treves, we see him in the operating room. He says something like something about these abominable machines.
He says, we're seeing a lot more of these kinds of injuries, and like the machines are sort of like creeping more and more into their society and injuring them and harming them and maiming them, and it's his job.
He says you can't reason with them.
Yes,
which I think is significant.
Yeah.
But so I do think that this is a very deliberate choice by David Lynch to kind of make this comment about industrialization or modernization. And I like what you've said here too, in linking it up with like the wrath of nature. This opening sequence is just amazing. I'm sort of getting in more and more interested in Lovecraft and like the kind of like Cthulhu universe. And so I think that this elephant has like a very Lovecraftian vibe. We have this really distorted sound of the elephant's kind of what would you call that? Does an elephant wail?
Something like that. A whale.
Like,
trumpet.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's like an elephant's trumpeting, but it's sort of distorted and
bellowing.
synthesized. Yeah, very unsettling. And then you see its trunk like a Lovecraftian tentacle, flailing around, and its hide. Lynch does some really cool stuff with overlays of a woman's face with the sort of framed by the hides of elephant, in a way that really resembles what John Merrick ends up looking like when we see him, with these kind of bulbous growths over his eyes. So it's a very, very clever beginning, I think, and kind of like sets the tone perfectly.
Yeah, well, I want the story that the Carney always tells about how the Elephant Man came to be is his mother was, and I think this is pretty clearly like complete fiction, on every level. But his mother was, struck down while pregnant by elephants in some obscure African island. And that's how he became the Elephant Man. And what made me, I think what's being alluded to is this old theory that if a woman who's pregnant like stares at something enough or is like psychologically affected by it, that can like form the child in her womb.
Wow.
So like there's actually the only reason I have this in mind is because this is used in interpreting a certain passage in the Old Testament. I think in Genesis where I think it's, I might get this wrong, but I think it's Jacob and Esau, and there's like the different colored they divide the livestock of like different colors, spotted or non-spotted or something, and or they hold, he like holds a rod of a certain color before the mothers of a certain livestock, and then they give birth to children of that color, something like that. And this goes along with this theory that like if you hold a colored cloth in front of like a pregnant animal, then her child will be like that color.
Wow.
And things like that. So the idea is that like, these things are passing in through the eyes, or in this case, maybe more than the eyes, like through the kind of the psyche of this trauma,
Wow.
this traumatic attack. And so I think that's kind of like the pre-scientific theory that's being alluded to there.
And the carnival then represents kind of the realm of the pre-scientific. It represents, it's a contrast to the scientistic age that's emerging.
Oh, yeah.
It's the place where kind of the old folk explanations are what are presented as reality, and where you have this sort of collection of freaks that don't fit in the world that respectable doctors and and manufacturers and all these kinds of things live, and so that's the world where we find John Merrick at the beginning. And I mean, maybe we'll get into this, but I mean, his sort of in and out and in and out again of that world is, I think, really important in understanding his character and the movie.
Yeah, the Carney is so great, played by Freddie Jones. He just brings this really intense, crazed energy to the role, and he's clearly something who is profiting off the Elephant Man and abusing the Elephant Man, but he also speaks of him in like hushed, almost reverential tones. After he first shows Dr. Treves the Elephant Man and agrees to let him take him to the hospital for a while, he says, "Now I think we understand one another." What's the line?
We understand one another perfectly.
Yeah, more than money has changed hands, and so it's like he's initiating the Doctor into this mystical Carney world or something.
Yeah, and then he comes to resent the Doctor because he sees the Doctor as essentially just standing in his place, just profiting from the Elephant Man in a different and more respectable way. And he has a point, it has to be said. And I think that Anthony Hopkins plays that role really well, because you actually, at least I do anyway, like watching him act, I see that tension kind of, that he's working through that a little bit. He realizes that. Like, there's the scene at the beginning when he first displays John Merrick to his colleagues, and it's kind of horrifying. I mean, it's very much like what you've just seen in the carnival. Yes. When the curtain is pulled back and the punters pay their money to take a look.
Even down to the instruction to turn around, please. He's still having him perform the exact same gestures, basically.
Yeah, and kind of and the last piece of it is this sort of revealing of his genitals. I don't know if you noticed that part, but it's like there's this one part where he mentions his genitals, and then there's somebody behind the curtain like taking off the last piece of something. And now again, you don't need to like read too much anything sexual into that or whatever, but it is like a kind of show. I mean, it's like a kind of peep show, or it's like something like that. But on the other hand, John Merrick's character is really interesting because he, one of the most striking scenes to me is the part where you first see him dressed up in fancy clothes, and you see him almost kind of preening, almost like he's welling up with pride, like I don't know, like he almost kind of gets it too, like he's in on the game, whether it's Mr. Bites or whether it's Dr. Treves,
right?
He's, and I don't want to be too cynical about it, because I do think it is ultimately a movie about human dignity, and it is a beautiful movie about, seeing the humanity even in this deformity. But the brilliance of the movie is, I think it's complex. I mean, that all the characters realize that even though it's a portrait of human dignity, it's also a portrait of human depravity.
Yes, this ethical question is introduced very quickly, because when Dr. Treves first discovers the Elephant Man, he actually isn't even allowed to see him because the whole thing's being shut down by the police. Mm-hmm. And we have the carny, the proprietor, the owner, as he says, saying, this man's a freak. How else is he supposed to basically make a living? So right away, this question, it's problematized, right? It's like, is he being taken advantage of, or is this really the only recourse that he has to sort of have a life in this world? And there's a lot of stuff sort of surrounding him that gestures in this direction as well. There's a sign that Dr. Treves walks past as he enters into this freak show that says the fruit of the original sin. Mm-hmm. And he also goes past what looks like a baby or a fetus or something inside of a jar, and so there's kind of this indication that there's something primitive, something kind of fundamental, this like kind of fundamental human depravity that is being exhibited here, that's being wrestled with here. And that continues as a thematic consideration, as a strain in this film throughout, and in more or less explicit ways, to the point even of a scene with Dr. Treves asking his wife, am I a good man or a bad man?
Yeah.
And to me, like, this question sort of hangs in the air for everybody, but certainly for the doctor, certainly also for John Merrick himself. For him, his goodness or badness is also bound up with how he appears, and so we have him reflecting on this, especially with respect to his mother. We come to find out that he carries around with him a picture of his mother. We have to take him at his word. This may or may not be his real mother, but mm-hmm. Assuming that it is, she's beautiful. And so this is a question for him. How could he come from something so beautiful? And if he could find his mother again, would she accept him for who she is? He's tried so hard to be good. Yeah. So I think in The Elephant Man, we have sort of symbolically externalized this kind of commentary about the fundamental condition of us all, and what is really a fundamental question, an existential one for all of us who have to grapple with our own sinfulness, our own depravity, our own ugliness. Where does this come from? Yeah. And that's a tricky one.
Yeah, he's sort of a living embodiment of that question from the Gospels, the kind of who sinned, this man or his parents, or that sort of thing, And he gets that about himself, which is, I think, something that a modern person, we just are so trained not to entertain those kinds of ideas. And I don't think many of us would say that there's any that he doesn't personally bear any blame or fault for the deformity that he bears, but it is the product of the sinfulness of the world. And so, like, the question of why him, it's interesting that he asks himself that question. And then the question is well, is it then, okay, so he is this creature who kind of embodies original sin in a way that we can see. I mean, most of us embody it in ways you can't see, or whatever it may be. So we can see it in this guy, but then what do you do with it? As you've said, James, I mean, they're wrestling with this idea of does he use his deformity then as a livelihood? I mean, why not? I suppose we would ask. But it's it's kind of tricky because then there's the other opportunist who's Jim, the night porter, who is so sinister, and he's kind of like the darkest version of the three men who try to profit from Merrick's deformity, right? But even he sort of defends himself with the same logic. It's like, look, people want to see this, and this is what this guy's got. And it's significant that in I think probably the most horrifying scene in the movie, when he and this group of late night carousers bust into Merrick's room in the hospital, pour liquor down his throat and just
molest
awful.
him essentially.
Yeah, he's effectively assaulted. Yeah.
But at the end of that, what does Jim do? He puts a coin. He gives him a coin, like basically like, here's your cut. It's
a truly horrific, like, just
I think
unsettling scene to watch.
I think those sequences with the night porter are places where David Lynch's particular sensibility really shows, because he's not necessarily going off on some sort of weird surrealist digression, and yet he's bringing in this sort of sensitivity to what is going to upset, what is going to get under your skin, in a film that's about this very deformed man, about deformity. The most hideous, monstrous, nightmarish sequences we get are these ones with people taking advantage of him at night, and this night porter showing up like a kind of imp. Like this.
It's like a reverse of a monster nightmare. It's like he's sitting in his room and they come outside the window. The regular people come outside the window and,
yes, and it's
their faces.
truly nightmarish and disturbing.
Yeah.
But in a way that kind of catches you off guard, and in a way that I think really demonstrates an artful hand on the part of David Lynch to create these sequences.
I think, David Lynch was always so... he didn't like to be forthright at all about what things meant or anything when asked about things. But I do, in the things by him that I've seen, I do appreciate maybe Eraserhead is a little bit too weird or too far beyond the pale. But a lot of the stuff that he's made, I find his kind of surrealist vision to be really almost like you can tell that what he's trying to say is, real life is weirder than any attempt I could make to be weird. And I don't know if I'm expressing that exactly right, but that scene when they bust in on him like that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's so horrific and beyond, I wouldn't have imagined something like that. And yet at the same time, when you're watching it, you're like, this could happen. You can imagine something strange like this, even though it really is like nothing you've seen depicted before. So I don't know, maybe that's part of the populist surrealist thing that the critic talks about with regard to his vision.
Yeah, well, I think that this is something that people don't necessarily immediately appreciate about some of these stranger artistic expressions, these stranger aesthetics, is that oftentimes there's like a trickle-down effect in terms of the kinds of techniques that are being, and methods that are being explored in the more abstracted or strange realm. Those can be applied by skillful artists in more concrete, more grounded, maybe more directly accessible ways to great effect. Yeah. And I think that that's kind of what you're getting here, where Lynch will show you at other places in the film, look, I'm going to do this weird little montage and it's going to create a mood. It's going to leave an impression. It's going to function in a particular way. And it's going to be very apparent that that's what I'm doing, because all of a sudden now you're going to be seeing like clouds and steam and strange sounds. We're going to zoom into this void. But then in other places, I'm going to do that in in a way that's much more integrated with the action of the scene, such that you might not notice what I've done here, but I'm using the same tool set, and I think that's very much what's happening.
Yeah, Thomas, you mentioned the cinematographer Freddie Francis before, and I think he's a really important. He's super important in establishing exactly what you're saying, James. Freddie Francis actually directed a bunch of horror movies in the 60s and 70s. He worked for Hammer, and he worked for Amicus as well. The two, Hammer was kind of the big horror production company in England, but Amicus or Amicus, I don't know which way they say it, but they were kind of like the little sister of Hammer. And so he had been a cinematographer, then he worked as a director and made a whole bunch of movies. And I think that there is a kind of horror element that comes through in the film for sure. And I think the horror genre gets at that kind of presentation of the absurd with the kind of goal of unveiling something about reality that you get in The Elephant Man. And in this way, I think that's a way to compare The Elephant Man with Eraserhead, even though Eraserhead is really gruesome and I think not very hopeful at all at the end. It's still this like kind of cult body horror movie. And in some respects, I think The Elephant Man is almost a kind of more mainstream and ultimately more hopeful rehash of some of that same idea. Mm-hmm. And I think Freddie Francis is a big piece of that.
I wonder how much of that went into the decision to shoot this in black and white.
Yeah.
Because yes, the black and white certainly gives it, on the one hand, like a kind of historical vibe. The pictures that we have of the real life Joseph Merrick, those are all in black and white or sepia toned. But it also gives it this kind of horror feel. And I also don't know if this is just me or not, but I kind of was picking up on what seemed to me to be nods toward German expressionism with the way that things are lit and the kind of angular interiors that scenes play out in. Mm-hmm. It made me think of this film that I saw many, many years ago, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or something about Dr. Caligari. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you, I can't really remember what the movie's about. I know that it's sort of like in the canon, super important example of German expressionism. But I think that there's even like a carny element in that film too. Yeah. I think that there's some thematic similarities there. So, I just kind of wonder how much all of this was operating for David Lynch, because it does seem like he's doing things to kind of situate this within a kind of horror or monster movie context. I was thinking too of all of these kind of examples of monsters from that period, Victorian England, types of like, Frankenstein or Dracula, mm-hmm. or Jekyll and Hyde. I just recently read the Robert Louis Stevenson short story, and actually, what's really cool is at the beginning of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the whole thing is sort of set off by Mr. Hyde one night, late at night, trampling this little girl. So this guy is kind of, walking around late at night, and he sees this kind of aggressive, monstrous, juggernaut-like figure just plow over a little girl. And we get that exact thing happen in this film, yes. where John Merrick is being harassed by these boys in a train station. He's hooded, so they don't know who he is, but he's still kind of a ghastly figure running through the train station in his sort of
stampeding way. Like an elephant, right?
Yes, he's, right.
And crashes into the little girl. Yeah, I didn't know.
Walks right over her. I think that might be a direct sort of mm-hmm. reference to Mr. Hyde.
Interesting.
So I do think that Lynch is being very deliberate about this.
Yeah, I agree. Well, again, Freddie Francis made a Frankenstein movie for Hammer. So I think that's deliberate for sure. I think the German expressionism thing is right on. I mean, I think, that there's an adjective in the Oxford English Dictionary, Lynchian, which calls to mind the term Kafkaesque to me. It's a similar kind of like appeal to, a kind of absurdism that is unique to that particular artist. I was thinking actually as I was watching The Elephant Man this time, I was thinking about the Woody Allen movie Shadows and Fog, which is another homage to German expressionism, which has a carnival kind of setting about it. So yeah, I think that's very much what Lynch is going for.
Yeah, I don't know that we've talked a lot about the horrific elements of the film, but the film is, it's very touching.
Yes.
It's very, very moving sequence. And, what we're moved by is both, the compassion that some of the characters like Mr. Treves and his wife, or what's the name of the actress played by Anne Bancroft?
Yeah,
the theater
Madge
actress
Kendall.
who comes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Miss Kendall, she comes to visit him, but also because, the revelation of this character of John Merrick and what kind of person he is, it takes a long time before he even speaks in the film. He's kind of, terrified into silence. He doesn't want people to hear his voice, I guess. And also he's just so abused that he just doesn't speak. And because of that, Dr. Treves initially assumed that he's an idiot, that he's just, mentally disabled and doesn't really understand what's going on. And he even says, I hope he is,
Right.
because the alternative is that he perfectly understands what's going on. You know?
Yeah. I think he says, pray God he's an idiot or something like that,
Yeah. And so, but it's revealed that he's not, because Dr. Treves is sort of teaching him to speak, coaching him for this interview with, I guess, the head of the hospital, to try to convince him that he should be able to stay here and be cared for. And that seems to fail. But then there's this sort of famous scene where he begins to recite Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And he continues beyond the point where he had been coached. And then they run back in and say, how do you know that? He said, well, I used to read the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, every day.
Yeah. And
so we realize this is, when you think about this character reading the Bible, and then somehow, I'm not Anglican. Andrew, you can, as a former Anglican, you can probably relate to this. But somehow when he says the Book of Common Prayer, that makes it seem like even more like
you're
gentlemanly or something. I don't know. From my perspective as an American,
Yeah, he speaks well. I mean, that's an interesting thing about John Merrick. I mean, he doesn't have a Cockney accent. He doesn't, he speaks well.
It's interesting.
And there's a lot of, maybe you guys have researched more than I have about the actual Joseph Merrick's kind of social status and his background. But I mean, John Merrick doesn't fit in society because of his looks, but otherwise he kind of does, as you say, like
he's very genteel, very,
when he's presented with this sort of like gentleman's kit that has all of these all of these things that a gentleman would need to dress himself and shave and make himself look nice or whatever. He's touched by the gift, but he's not taken aback as if they've given it to someone who doesn't deserve it. I mean, he kind of knows what to do with it, doesn't he? Yeah. And when he's given the nice clothes to wear, you can tell he takes a lot of pride in his appearance. And but if we could pause for a second on his faith, I think it's interesting that he says that he reads the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, and then he sets about this project in his room to build a cathedral. And in fact, the last scene of the movie, he finishes the cathedral before, well, I don't want to spoil it, but in the last scene of the movie, but, so it seems like he is a Christian. I mean, or it seems like he is actually serious about his faith, although that doesn't, we don't see him going to church, for probably obvious reasons, but I think that's significant. I mean, I do kind of wonder if he then becomes a character who implicitly we come to understand has borne all of this suffering and torture like our Lord. I mean, he actually sort of gets it that he he doesn't fully understand why he's in the circumstances he's in, but he finds a way to endure.
Yeah, it is interesting because that the religious themes aren't very immediately apparent necessarily. Despite this sequence of the recitation of this psalm, it's a pretty central moment. But I do think that it is significant that it's this is the moment when his humanity is really recognized. I think that there might be a kind of an implicit nod at Christianity as the cultural element that really enables him to escape from this terrible life. It's the recitation of this psalm that sort of initially kind of pulls him out. But but then also there are other mentions of it, like when the Princess of Wales, Alexandra, comes to speak to the board of the hospital and relaying a message from the Queen, and a specific appeal that they do the Christian thing.
That's right.
So I think that there is this kind of implicit nod that that it's actually Christianity, a Christian moral sense, that enables one to recognize his humanity and then to afford him the charity that we owe to our neighbor.
Yeah, and then I think in Anthony Hopkins' character of the doctor, you see him kind of emerge at the end as somebody who maybe, in a way, almost kind of accidentally stumbles into becoming a man of deeper virtue. Like it all begins with, he doesn't seem like a bad man at all from the start. I mean, he certainly seems to want to proceed in a humane way from the beginning with John Merrick, but we also understand that he's first of all interested in Merrick as his next project, and you see this in the little conversation he has with one of his doctor colleagues who busts into the room and sees Merrick, and he sort of comes out and he hushes him and he says, "Don't tell anybody," like this is going to be this big reveal.
Yeah.
But then by the end of the movie, they're having a kind of breezy conversation about how, oh well, we'll have to go to the theater again sometime, and just kind of talking as two men. I think that there is, I'm hesitant to sort of always, bang on about, well, this is like sort of the gospel smuggled in under the covers here. But I do think, I think it's not exactly smuggled in. I think it's pretty evident.
Well, I mean, it's a historical tale, and the influence of Christianity on these kinds of matters is just a part of the historical reality of the tale. So it's, whether it's David Lynch or the scriptwriters intending it or not, it just is part of the historical reality.
Right.
And so it's part of the cultural reality portrayed. And also the film does nothing to subvert that. What you don't get, a pointed scene of a minister treating him badly, or, right. or somebody saying something like Christian and then being like super hypocritical about it or something.
Because there is real charity on display, and so when that board does vote to give him a home at the hospital, in perpetuity, that's a real exercise of charity, and you see how joyful that makes everybody, even those who were maybe at first skeptical of his arriving at the hospital and his staying there. You have the sort of the head honcho, you have the head nurse, you have Dr. Treves himself, all just beaming with satisfaction when they're able to offer him this gift and tell him welcome home, and so that really isn't undermined at all.
Yeah, I was thinking of the scene when the head nurse kind of conks Jim, the night porter, on the head, to kind of rescue Merrick, and she's very proud of that. I mean, and she really, it's very evident, as you say, James, that, I mean, it's his home in this hospital, and everyone who works there. There is, it seems, even though you have these like scenes where there's like crazy chaos with like, the night shift of injured or insane people coming into the hospital, there's still this sense of like the humane kind of wins out as the general feeling of where this man lives. And maybe it's because of him. Maybe that's the point. Like his coming to occupy space in this like kind of, in the kingdom of science, I guess, humanizes it to a degree. Yeah,
and actually we see that exact same dynamic play out later in the film when he's sort of pulled back into the carny world. Mm-hmm. He's kidnapped essentially by his former owner and taken across the continent to the or across the channel to the continent. He's in France somewhere, and they've linked up with a new carny troupe, and he's being mistreated severely again, and sort of suffering silently, and it moves the hearts of these other misfits, and we get, again, talk about reality is stranger than fiction. We get this very strange fairy tale like sequence of this parade of freaks, helping him to escape, leading him on. It's almost like something taken out of a weird surrealist film, but
Well,
actually it's happening right here in this world.
That scene in particular to me is a real homage to Fellini. I think,
yes.
I think
Oh,
that
good
that
point.
has a strong feel of the end of 8.5 and certain scenes in La Strada.
That's a great point.
I love that scene.
Great point. Yeah. Yeah, Kenny Baker, by the way, the dwarf is plays R2D2 in Star Wars. But I wanted to mention also the point about science and humanizing and stuff. There's that scene where there's the debate between Dr. Treves and the head nurse. I never quite picked up her name, Mother's Gum or something. I don't remember. Yeah. And she, by the way, played by the actress who plays Thomas More's wife. I noticed in Man for All Seasons. But Lady Alice, but she criticizes him for allowing these society people to come in and visit John because she says they're putting him on display all over again and they don't really care about him. And he criticizes her back by saying, well, when he first came here, you weren't always showing him, loving kindness or something like that. And she really is defensive about that and says, well, if I cared for him. I, cleaned his sheets, all this stuff, and that's loving kindness essentially. And then you go back and watch the movie a second time, and you see the scene where she first interacts with him. It's not that loving,
Mm-hmm.
She's kind of saying he needs to get out of here. He's like talking to a brick wall, blah blah blah. And so you see that. I mean, there is this dynamic, from what I understand, in hospitals of like, this is a grind for the people who work there, and they don't always see the individual people as individual human beings, even though technically they can't always defend themselves by saying, of course I'm treating them with loving kindness, I'm caring for them, but
it's still a well-observed point that at the end of the day, she is taking care of him, and that very well may be what's motivating her primarily, irrespective of the whatever sort of mood she might be in on a particular day.
Yes, but what I mean is that there's room for all of these characters to grow, and in that scene, she's a little discomfited, I think, by that observation.
Yeah.
I think that she represents too a certain posture that people have in the medical world, where if you are too close to your patients, then it's going to affect you, and so you have to remain kind of utilitarian, or else you just kind of can't live because you're just going to be agonizing all the time. But it's not good for our souls to be utilitarian. I mean, it's, and in a sense, so just to reiterate the point I already made about kind of the humanizing effect that Merrick has on the hospital, I think he in the nurse we see in particular his ability to kind of get her out of this utilitarian mindset, and we see that in John Gielgud too, right? I mean, his argument as kind of the chief doctor of the hospital is something like, look, we don't take incurable people here. Like we have goals. If these people need our help and we can meet their needs, then we admit them and, whatever. But it's all so kind of cold and just kind of, again, to use the word utilitarian. And Merrick kind of blows all of that up.
I feel like the treatment of, or the care for incurables is kind of like a typically Catholic work as well. I mean, you see, we have these orders dedicated to just that kind of palliative, work.
And to his credit, he does sort of say, can we find a place for him, a home for incurables,
He's by no means callous, but
and then later, when it's being brought before the board of the hospital, and there is one person in particular who's very resistant to the idea of keeping him there, he does specifically appeal to this sacred duty they have to cure the sick, So I think that there is a point there of what their purpose is as physicians, but certainly there's also a real love that begins to form between John Merrick and the rest of the people that he comes into contact with at the hospital.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes, the scene that makes me cry the most, is when he first visits Dr. Treves and his wife in their home. And first of all, he's just, the first thing that happens is he meets Dr. Treves' wife, and she just is, basically polite to him, and he just breaks down in tears because he says, I'm not used to being treated so well by a beautiful woman. I can say I've had experiences like that myself, like I not to say I'm the elephant man or something, but like I did deeply relate to him when he said that, because I've had experiences where I've been very moved by like someone like that, treating me with like kindness and consideration, you know, and like friendship. But then there's also the scene where she breaks down later because he starts talking. He shows them the picture of his mother, and he says, "I must have been such a disappointment to her. You know, I wish I could find her, and you know, she would love me knowing that I have these wonderful friends." And she just can't take it. And it's like, it's really, you know, you get these opportunities to like scream with the characters who are screaming in the film. Like we see all these characters seeing the Elephant Man for the first time and screaming or weeping, and you get the experience to emote with the characters as they're kind of reacting to him, but also to like that also brings us into his experience as well. It like helps us to empathize with him via the characters who are empathizing with him.
My favorite scene in the film is between him and the actress when they begin reciting this section from Romeo and Juliet. It's just amazing. Such a brilliant moment, and I don't know whose idea that was, but they chose like the perfect sequence from the work of Shakespeare to because it's this moment when Romeo and Juliet first meet at the ball or whatever, and they're flirting with each other, and there's this sort of extended analogy of like my lips are pilgrims or something, and
it's like a metaphysical poet kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, it's a concrete analogy about like my lips and your hands are analogous to pilgrims and like the reverence of statues of saints or things, and then there's this idea that like my sin is being taken from me and transferred to you when I kiss you, and then you give it back to me, and so it's this very layered metaphor that's being employed by Shakespeare, but it works perfectly for the Elephant Man, you know, and the dynamic of what's going on between him and this actress who's taken a genuine interest in him. By the end of it, she does end up giving him a kiss, you know, on the cheek, a sort of friendly kiss, and she says this wonderful line, "Oh, you're no Elephant Man, you're Romeo." You know, and I just got goosebumps just now, even recalling this. But it's like, you know, aside from this scene being a perfect example of what I would call the kind of the ability for you to throw literally anything at Shakespeare and Shakespeare will be able to contain it.
That's great.
It's also just such a perfect, layering of you know, this literary illusion that brings so much to this actual encounter that's happening between Merrick and this actress.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice kind of nod to romanticism as well. I think there's a kind of like romantic sensibility that comes through in the movie that's consonant with its Victorian setting, like this sort of apply Shakespeare to everything, or you know, I think, you know, that the monsters, you know, the monster's inner beauty is sort of, you know, revealed, like sort of Beauty and the Beast, and I don't know. I think Shakespeare fits into that really well. And then I think
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Andrew, what you thought of this sort of subplot with the actress and the theater, because you know, in some ways it sticks out. And then, of course, when they end up going to the theater later, and it's this very strange play that they see with this like costumed cat jumping around and, you know, all sorts of fantastical elements. It does seem somehow out of step with a lot of what we've seen elsewhere in the film, but you're saying that it's consonant with something deeper.
Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, I don't know if what they go see at the theater is. I'm curious about that myself. I mean, it would have been interesting, or it would have just made a different impact, I suppose, if they had gone to see a Shakespeare play or something like that. But yeah, they go see this pantomime, and you know, it's almost like a kind of children's entertainment. I don't know what that is meant to say exactly. I was kind of scratching my head about that on this viewing, but I mean, I do think it's beautiful that, I mean, and it may just be because, you know, he's the guest of the Princess of Wales. And so the idea isn't so much that they're going to experience art, but that they're going out in public. And so, any play is as good as another. But there is that beautiful moment at the end of that when Anne Bancroft's character comes out on the stage and then recognizes Merrick, and then he stands and everybody stands, and it's really, and then it's almost the very end of the movie. But that's kind of his curtain call and his final bow. And I think it's important to remember that, of course, he's a man, in a sense, a man of the theater himself. Like he's a performer. He has been performing in front of people in this grotesque environment for years and years. And I think there's something fitting about the end of his life, that he's sort of fully embraced by the theater world and recognized by kind of patrons of the arts, including royalty. So I don't know. I don't know why that play, though.
Well, that's fascinating. I think it might just be as simple as that play offers Lynch another opportunity to do his like overlay of visual elements that are passing across the face of Merrick, and I don't know. There's this fantasy that
more of people pretending to be animals as well. I think that's interesting.
Right.
He plays with that throughout the film for sure.
Yeah, but it's interesting to me that the one other, talking about fantasy, there is one other moment when we see John Merrick really fantasizing, and it's after he's been gifted this box of stuff. And I had to laugh and turn to Thomas when we were watching this, and I was just like, I have no idea what any of those things are for.
Brushes
it's clear that he does. He's very happy about having received this gift. But if you gave that to me, I would just be like, what on earth is this? What am I supposed to do with this?
So he's interrupted by the people coming in and harassing him.
That was my point
at this point.
Is that he's got his smoking jacket on, he's holding his cigarette holder, and he's having this interaction where he's introducing himself to the picture of the actress, and he's doing so in a very affected manner, after having applied some cologne to his neck, and it's at that moment precisely when the people at night come and assault him, and
because that's if anybody were to walk into the room while you were doing that, it would already be very embarrassing. Like that's the moment you wouldn't want somebody to walk into your room, is when you're like talking to your mirror or something.
Yes, but what's the culminating act of that whole sequence is they take the mirror and they put it up in front of him.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a direct shattering of his fantasy.
Yeah.
That's true. So I can't help but think about, what, Shakespeare's description of the theater, what is it, in Hamlet, I think, about holding a mirror up to nature, So I don't know how the theater and this fantasy world that we're brought into at the very end of the film sort of links up with that, but it does seem to, somehow resonate with this dynamic of fantasy and how it's operating in the world of John Merrick.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's shortly after that he's thrown back into the world of just being a kind of carnival performer. And it's like that's the absolute apex for him. And then it immediately crashes down. And I don't know if there's some kind of theological point there as well about pride and the fall or something like that. I mean, I don't take Merrick as being like particularly puffed up with pride, but he is definitely in that moment imagining himself as something else. It's silly. Yeah.
James, I wanted to ask you, haven't talked about John Hurt's performance much.
Oh my gosh.
So I wanted his performance and the whole presentation of that character.
Yeah. Well, so John Hurt is an amazing actor. And we've seen him at least once before, right? Because he was in I commented, I forget the name of the character, but he plays the guy in A Man for All Seasons, who's I'm blanking on his name.
Yeah, Richard Rich or something like that.
Richard Rich. Yes, yeah. And he there's the famous line, of course, where Thomas More says, "Why, Richard, it profiteth not a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul, but for Wales." And then, of course, I just thought it was funny because the Princess of Wales comes to save his butt in this movie.
Anyway. But it's certainly not an easy task that he's been given in having to play this character wearing, pounds of makeup on his face. There's very little mobility in his face.
He said, I think they've managed to finally make me hate acting. Yeah.
Well, he does a terrific job because what is he left with? He's left with his eyes. He's left with his voice and his mouth and the kinds of strange noises that he can make with his mouth and with his breathing. And he's left with his body. And he uses all of those to really great effect throughout the film. If I could just take it in order, his eyes are always super expressive and alive in any given scene. So we'll see him kind of trapped in this face, and his eyes just darting around, taking in the room like a trapped animal, or, sort of gazing off wistfully as he recites Psalm 23 or reflects on his mother or something. And then other times when he's moved to tears, in receiving the kindness of someone, or when he's being assaulted, and abused. So there's a lot of range just in the eyes alone that you see in John Hurt. They also do this really cool thing, I think, in several sequences where they bring the mic very, very close to his mouth. Sometimes I wonder if it's not actually inside the mask with him somehow, because sometimes it just sounds, especially early on, like we're getting sound that's from so close to his mouth. So we can hear a lot of the kind of mouth noises and gurgles and breath. But that kind of goes away as the film goes on and as he gets more well-spoken. But early on, oh man, it's really unsettling. The sound design, just as an aside, the sound design broadly is very good. And I noted during the credits that it was David Lynch worked together with someone on the sound design. So Lynch had a pretty direct hand in that as well. But yeah, this mouth acting, if I can call it that, but then also certainly the vocal work that goes into speaking the way that he speaks, and then sort of speaking better or worse, as the film progresses. That's all very well done. And then finally, in his physicality, we get a lot of expression there. Not just in the sort of convincing rendering of this physical deformity that causes him to walk in a particular way or move in a particular way, but then also in, some of these moments where it becomes particularly expressive, like when he's running from the boys in the train station and sort of collapses to the floor in the men's bathroom, or when he's playing make-believe in his room, or when he's pouring tea for his guests, in a very kind of gentlemanly way. And then finally, I think the moments when he's sleeping are very nice, because he has to sleep in this very particular way, where he can't lie down, or else presumably he'll like suffocate himself or something. His head is just too heavy, so he has to sit upright. But there's something very expressive in that gesture too. I don't know how the real Joseph Merrick slept, but this was something that John Hurt would have had to kind of figure out is how am I going to render this physically on screen? And the result is something that's very pathetic, but then also affords him an opportunity in places to be expressive. We get this really nice sequence. It's another one of these sort of like surrealist digressions when the camera pans really closely into his head, sort of down across he's got his knees up and his hands on his knees and his head is buried into his hands, but he's having a kind of nightmare and his hands are kind of moving in this very tense way. So I hope that paints a little bit of a picture for anybody who hasn't seen this film of just how much John Hurt is able to do with a very very restrictive kind of there's a lot of restrictions that the makeup and the costuming places on him.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, John Hurt was an incredibly versatile actor, and I guess the Academy Awards they invented a new category of best makeup the year after The Elephant Man, because everyone felt like, I think it was nominated for a bunch of awards, but maybe didn't win any. I didn't look that up, but
I think so. Yeah.
But John Hurt didn't win Best Actor anyway, and there was this little period where it was sort of a joke in Hollywood where if you kind of uglified yourself up enough, you'd win an Oscar that year or something like that. But I guess this was sort of before that happened. But your point, James, about how he, so great makeup is one thing and great sound design is another thing, but you have to have the actor who can do it. And that's the combination with John Hurt and the prosthetics and the sound design and stuff like that is really like nothing else you'll ever see in a movie, I don't think.
David Lynch himself did the sound design for the film. And I think he tried to do the makeup too, but it didn't work, so he had to get someone else to do it. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the areas of overlap where with a movie like Dune. I feel like some of the kind of monstrous creatures that you see in Dune are
right.
The Elephant Man in this film looks like something that comes out of a David Lynch film.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a character in Eraserhead, the previous film, the woman in the radiator who sings the In Heaven song on the stage, who has these sort of facial prosthetics that, I mean, they're not anything like the contraption that John Hurt would have had to wear, but I mean, David Lynch is definitely playing with this kind of body deformity stuff, and especially on the face, even in his first film.
Yeah. Boy, that film was weird, man. That Eraserhead was it was both it was like stretches of extreme boredom punctuated with like just really revolting images and just like a very nasty vision of human life.
I really wish that I had gotten a chance to watch it before we recorded this.
Yeah, but I mean,
I rather think it makes the opposite point to The Elephant Man at the end. I mean, it's sort of it's about a man who is just paralyzed by reality, and that there's this sort of squishing out of life that seems to be kind of the only end for a humanity that is just completely lost. And I don't know, The Elephant Man seems to me, as I've said I think a few times, and you guys have too, it's a hopeful movie in the end. I mean, it's and maybe we can talk about the very last scene if we don't want to spoil.
Sure,
I mean, there maybe is a little bit of wiggle room there to kind of try and guess at what exactly Lynch is saying about the death scene. But I don't know. I mean, I take it as a man who is just dying, but who, as I said before, sort of has had his curtain call. And when the credits roll, you go away from the movie feeling like there is hope for the world, and that, there is such a thing as human dignity, and that there is such a thing as virtue, and there are these opportunities that we have in the strangest of circumstances to kind of grow in virtue, to understand the transcendent reality of the world. And I don't know, that's my takeaway, which is not at all my takeaway from Eraserhead.
Yeah, well, when we watched it the first time, James said, I don't know about those last 15 seconds. After he dies, and we get this one last...
It's this weird, like, cosmic sequence where we're sort of going through the stars, and then the woman's eyes reemerge.
Yeah, Roger Ebert, who did not like this movie, said, what, is he becoming the space child from 2001 at the end or something? But no, it's we get his mother reciting a line from Tennyson, which I don't have, but the basic gist is nothing will die. I don't remember everything in between, but...
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, some people wonder if that's kind of Lynch's own interest in transcendental meditation or kind of Eastern theology or philosophy sort of coming through at the end. I'm not quite so sure. I think like the Tennyson, again, is maybe a bit of a nod to Romanticism, where there was a little bit of a kind of a spiritualism or something going on there. The question that interests me, though, is, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks this, but I suppose a person could think that maybe... maybe what happens in the scene where Merrick dies is that he sort of gives up and like he knows he's going to die when he lays his head down on the bed rather than in his normal posture, kind of propped up with the pillows. And so is it a kind of a suicide? I'm only putting that on the table to say I don't think that it is, but it is an interesting choice to show him, at the end of the movie, kind of doing something that we and he are pretty sure isn't going to go well.
Yeah, I read it as, well, he, first of all, they've set this up by him saying, I wish I could lie down to go to sleep like normal people. And he's got this picture of a woman lying down and sleeping in her bed in his room. And I just read it as not suicide, but as this beautiful image of like finally being at rest. Yeah. Like everything is finally satisfied. He said, I'm happy every hour of the day. Something, because I know that I'm loved. And I just read it as this poetic image of rest. I mean, the movie ends with him dying, and how else would they have done it? Does he die in his sleep while he's sitting up? That wouldn't be as satisfying, right. Well, psychologically,
I looked it up, and this is the real way that the real life Joseph Merrick died.
Okay.
And so I think that there is something kind of complicated going on in there. Of course, I don't want to read it as a sort of suicide through and through, but I think that there is probably a kind of weariness at this life, there might just be on a very basic level, he's just fed up having to sleep this way,
Yeah, I think that's right. I read, and this didn't come through for me on this viewing, but I was reading about how it's evident, I guess it wasn't totally evident to me, but it's evident that he's much sicker after he comes back from his kidnapping in Europe, and that even though he has this beautiful evening where he goes out and goes to the theater or whatever, that it's evident that he is nearing death. I mean, it could just be he knew that the end was near, and there.
Well, in any case, one gets the impression that if he were to wake up the next day, he would still be very happy about that.
Exactly.
So that it might be that he's just hoping that he can go to sleep and wake up the next day and be okay. You know,
I think that's the way to read it.
And we don't actually know that this is necessarily what kills him.
Yeah, I see it as he's so much at peace that he's either willing to accept that risk, or he is just he's in such a different state of mind about who he is and his value in the world that he is able to fully identify with the rest of humanity,
right?
And
yes.
Lay down.
So the point is that it in no way undermines the fundamental hopeful posture of this film.
That's right.
For me, it is a very beautiful ending, and then you're treated to another 15 strange seconds of David Lynch cosmic odyssey.
Yep. Yeah. Anything else, or should we wrap up?
No, I think that's it. I wasn't sure at the outset, before watching this film, what we would be able to say about it, but I think there's quite a lot to say. I'm glad that we watched it. Anybody who hasn't seen it, I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah. It's a great one.
Yeah, and you guys, one of you or both of you made the point earlier that, if there's any David Lynch film to watch, it's this one, to be sure. I mean, I recommend other things. I recommend Twin Peaks to people who are kind of interested in that kind of thing. But I would recommend The Elephant Man to anyone. I think that it succeeds on every level, really.
And you mentioned The Straight Story, which I haven't seen, but for whatever it's worth, I've heard that is also one of his more accessible and sort of happy films.
Totally acceptable. Yeah, I mean, it's just a straightforward movie about a strange but heartwarming situation where a man rides a tractor 300 miles to go to, I forget what it is. I think it's to his brother's funeral or something like that. Huh, it's just a sweet, sweet movie. Yeah, there's nothing. The only weird thing is the idea of somebody riding a tractor that far, really.
Okay, cool. Anything you want to plug, Andrew?
Not at the moment, guys. I'll tell you and your listeners, but I've been squirreled away lately working on a novel. So my output as far as criticism goes has been a bit less than usual lately. So be on the lookout one of these days for some fiction from yours truly. But until then,
awesome.
I still put out the odd film review, and my colleague Bobby Mixa and I are still, we stop and start, but we've got some great plans afoot at the Space Alvey Institute. Some good podcasts coming out, some good projects. So keep an eye on us over there.
All right, great. Well, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Well, if you'd like to see what else we're we've got going on at Catholic Culture, I would go to catholicculture.org/newsletter and subscribe to our Insights email newsletter, because then you'll keep up not only with all of our new podcasts, but also with our written commentary, news, liturgical year. And I've been writing a lot more articles lately, so you'll be able to see what I've been writing. And for that, I will see you next time with, what are we doing next? We're going to be doing having James Matthew Wilson on to discuss the Marx Brothers next, so that'll be interesting. All right, everybody, see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.